I think you find yourself getting better through failure and doing lots of different things and seeing what other people do and going, oh, I'll try a bit of that as well, or seeing what doesn't work and going, I'm definitely going to do that. Hello and welcome back to the McClaren Performance podcast. I've not done that introduction in a while. I haven't done an episode in a while. I've actually been busy for once, so I haven't had time to do this. And now I don't remember how to do this at all, but hopefully we'll just get into the swing of it. I wanted to do an episode just to come back, just a nice, easy one with my mate Tom Keeney, just talking about, well, to give some context, I'd just recently given a talk at Newcastle University, talking to a lot of students and people at that university about applying sports psychology, actually practically to sport. And there's quite a lot of lessons to take from that. The difference between learning it and studying about it at university and actually doing it are two really separate things. And there's a big gap between that. And I imagine, hopefully, there's a lot of people listening to this who are studying either sports psychology or sports science and want to take some lessons from us as we're two young, hip, cool people who have just started doing this. And we're just learning really from day one how to do it. But hopefully, there's some lessons for you lot listening as well. So, yeah, I kind of jumped the gun a bit, but introducing Tom Keeney. Tom, do you want to just kind of describe yourself in some words?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Tom Keeney, like Josh said there. So currently one of the first team sports scientists at Newcastle United Women. And on top of that as well, I'm studying my PhD at Northumbria University as well. And so before the journey and everything up until this point now, so done my undergraduate and my master's at Nottingham Trent, and then also had the fortune of working at Nottingham Forest Women for 2 years whilst I was there as well, before making the move up to the northeast for the PhD and to work for Newcastle.
Absolutely unbelievable. Yeah, I feel like you say, like I said, we just met each other this season working together, but I think we're in a very similar position where we studied what we're doing. You're still studying it a lot of ways, doing your PhD, but we gone on a full-time season Newcastle Women. We both worked part-time before, kind of in those environments as well, and kind of learning how to do it. And how I wanted to structure it today is to kind of go through 5 lessons each of us. You've got 5 lessons that you want to talk through. I've got 5. I don't really know what you've got. You don't really know what I've got. It'd be interesting to know and interesting to discuss each one. And hopefully for those people listening, it's something you can take away from that, because there is a bit of a gap between studying it and then actually doing it. And hopefully we can fill some of those gaps today. I think I'll just kick it off really with the first one that I've got, which I like to think you probably have it as well. Even though yours is sports science and I'm taught in sports psychology, I think you've got to love it. It's kind of my first lesson. You've got to love the profession that you do. I love sports psychology. I have a massive passion for it and always have done. And the reality is that it's still a job at the end of the day, though, and there's still a lot of challenges to it. So as much as you love what you do, there's still a lot of obstacles all the time, as there is naturally in any job. And for me to get through that, I've always got through it through absolutely loving the topic and loving the impact it can have when it's done right as well. So that's my first lesson really is for those people listening, if you're studying it, if you want to get into football or sport or whatever, make sure you really love what you're doing and what you're learning about and have that passion for it, because that's going to carry you quite a long way, because there's a long way to go in whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I think it's quite nice, really. So my first point really sort of ties in quite nicely to that I've written down here, and that was don't lose track of why you got started in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think for me that goes for students trying to get into sports science, sports psychology, whatever their sort of facet is, and it also works for players and coaches as well. Like there's this great thing that within professional sport and everything, it's really easy to get caught in the weeds of everything. It is a very all-consuming environment to be in. And that's some of the best parts of sport. It can be some of like the worst parts as well. You can get really tied into it. I think within that as well, like don't lose why you started in the first place. We always start something because we love it. We've got an interest in it, something along those sorts of lines. And so even when it does get tough, you can't lose track of why we started. That for me should be the nucleus of everything we try and do.
I'm going to ask you a real question here, because I don't understand it. Why do you actually love sports science? Because I couldn't find anything more boring to be involved in. So tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see your point there, mate. I think there is.
Well, not to be harsh, but yeah.
there can be an awful lot of data to wade through sometimes, but it does sometimes make things difficult. But for me, the love of sports science came from the fact, like, I think most sports scientists could probably relate to this, where you are a failed athlete. I think particularly, like, a lot of people that go into sports science degrees and everything had that ambition of being a professional in their sport. For me, it was cricket. Now that didn't work out, and everything I was told sort of 16, 17 and everything, that you won't be offered a contract. And I was like, okay, fair enough. And that then for me really is when I thought, well, the next best thing to being a professional athlete is working with them day in, day out.
Yeah.
And then sort of, you know, go on the lines of like, well, what really interests you? And at the start and everything, it was performance analysis before I even started university.
All right.
And I realized what it was about and how much footage you've got to watch and how boring that job can be.
Yeah.
And then I thought, right, well, what's the really cool side of it? And that then was the true sports science side of it, which sort of touched wood so far and everything I've really enjoyed and like continue to enjoy so much so decided to go on to a PhD.
I feel like a lot of people that work outside of in the staff around players are usually people that have wanted to be players themselves in some form or another. And this is the next best thing they could possibly find to work around it. I've always been a bit different because I'm not really. I've done sports, but I've never been dying to do that. I've always just been interested in psychology because I've always just been interested in the fact that the mind can improve performance, and it's such an untapped field as well, that isn't where I don't think it should be. So I've always just had a massive passion for it. But I always hear from people like yourselves who have wanted to be an athlete themselves and try and find the least boring job around it and try and get into it. But that's why I always advise that, though, like, actually really, really like that profession, what you do, because I imagine as an aspect what you do as well, where you enjoy improving athletes, like improving them and developing them physically and helping them. I imagine there's a lot of, obviously I do a lot of personal work with regards to psychology, but I imagine there's a lot of one-to-one conversations and getting to know people and helping them individually as well, alongside physically building them up. You've got those relationships also, I imagine.
Yeah, I think those really, like, those sort of soft skills of having those relationships with players are some of the most important parts of the role. I think it's great to be able to see that really objective progress on the pitch in terms of sort of they are moving better, they're moving quicker, they're fitter, they're faster, they're stronger from all the testing that we do. That's great, and that's a really nice sort of like notch to go. Yeah, we are really doing our job. But those relationships with players, and we can see how players grow personally and professionally from day one of pre-season, like in the case of this year, going from sort of part-time players and then that journey they've all been on to become like a full-time professional footballer is really, really nice to see as well, because I think you understand the small little role that you've had in that as well. I think it's important that you don't overstate your role as well. I think it is only a really, really small role that we have in pushing those players forward, because I think a lot of it is the player's own internal drive as well. But yeah, seeing those progressions, everything from players is really, really nice to see as well.
We'll touch on that one. I think that's number one. And you've probably got a shared kind of lesson in that as well, but I think you do have to love it. Tell me one of yours that you've got down.
Well, so that first one was really it, really, to be honest with you, mate. So that don't lose track of why you got started.
Yeah.
Understand it. And I think, like, more so from, let's say, the player side of things, I'll look at this maybe from a more academic point as well, for sort of some of the young academics watching as well. So there's a great paper by Alex Colvin that relates to female football here. And so she interviewed a load of WSL players. Obviously, the WSL has only gone professional within the last decade or so. And I think that in itself gives like a really nice sort of target, really. Now, one of the things that she spoke about was that, like, the realities of now football being work. And I think that's a really important thing. And I think it sort of breaks my heart a little bit sometimes when players talk about, oh, we've got to go into work tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, technically speaking, yes, it is work, but we're in such a fortunate position as either working in professional football or being professional footballers that it's not really unlike any other job.
Yeah.
Like, you get paid to do something that you love. And I think with that, now that it is becoming work, you shouldn't lose that reason either. And I think that's an important one for staff as well. Like, going from working in a part-time environment where we all have either a full-time job outside of this or in full-time academics outside of this, and the football side of thing is just the fun and the enjoyment side of it, to then working in a full-time professional environment where that is your job, you can't lose that enjoyment factor of it, because that's what you got into football for in the first place, because you enjoy what you do.
There's nothing like the intensity of it, is there? Like, I don't, not that I've worked in many other things myself. I've always been around psychology and sport, but I imagine there isn't. There's no, I've probably talked to you about this before, that working towards a Sunday Like there's nothing else in work like that. But that also alongside that has an intensity to it. Like you see me do my stuff. I mean, a lot of the time I'm just walking around talking to players and doing what I do. But there is also a real intensity to it because I never stop thinking about it. Like and you'll probably be the same, and we're all the same in a lot of ways. You don't stop thinking about, right, the next game's coming up, and oh, I might want to talk to so and so, I might want to do this, or thinking about that, thinking about what's going on. That and that doesn't leave me when I go home. Like that's all the time. That's probably not a healthy thing, but that is what it's like. But I think that's what it's like working in football, as opposed to anything else. Because you love it so much, it becomes all consuming at the same time. Like I said at the start, I haven't done this podcast for a while, but that's because the season started, and then all my focus went into that.
Yeah.
And that's you told me from your perspective, but that's what it's like for me. I think it's what it's like for other staff as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think I can certainly relate to that in the sense of even when you go home, you're always thinking about, like, naturally you reflect on that day in terms of like what went well. Could I have done anything differently that might have impacted things? And particularly from a sports science perspective as well, I always think the biggest question we've got to ask ourselves is what impact are we having on a daily basis? So I think that's really, really important because if you're not having an impact, there's not really much need for us there. Like everything you do has got to be done with a purpose. And I think that's the one thing that comes out from reflections. And then on top of that as well, you're always thinking about, could I tweak this? Could we add this into the program? Could we maybe take this out? Would it have an effect? And then on the flip side of that as well, because I've obviously still got the academics on top of things with the PhD, like even when I sit down and start writing and reading and everything, you're always then thinking of how can I apply theory to practice? And I think that's a really important skill for anyone in academics, no matter what sort of facet you're going into, whether it's in sport or elsewhere. That's always something I think you should keep sort of deep rooted in your beliefs in terms of reading something and seeing how does that research then translate to being on the pitch, on the grass with the players or in the gym. And that's really important as well. So yeah, I think like we mentioned it before in terms of the environment of football being really all consuming. And I think that's a double-edged sword in some senses. Like in one sense, it's great because you're doing what you love. But on the second sense, like you said there, it probably might not necessarily be always the healthiest of things when you're going home constantly ticking over and thinking about how things can change, what can you do to improve and everything. So it can sometimes be a slippery slope. I think that's then when, like, we're now a bit of downtime across the off season before pre-season starts up again. I think that's then really important that people do take a step back completely and sort of just try and unwind a little bit, because it is a like you said, the intensity of it is unmatched.
I saw it a lot when my dad was managing and working. That was all consuming for him. When he was managing at Borough, if I remember, in England and things like that, I barely see him. But when I did see him, he wouldn't be focused on what was happening at the time, and I never really understood it massively until I'd done it myself. And even though I play such a small part, being a psychologist, it's still very it's still the same. I realise what it's like actually working in it. It must be 10 times worse for a manager, more than that. It must be really bad. It was for my dad, but when you're doing a small part, even you still feel that intensity to it all the time. Football isn't a job. It's like everyone. It's a bit of advice I gave to when I gave that talk at Newcastle University as well. Like, it's football people. You got to be a football person for a number of different reasons, and whatever that means, I don't even know. But you've kind of got to be a football person to work in football, because you've got to work in that intensity of it, and you've got to be obsessed with it, and you've got to. It kind of goes on another point I've got later. We'll probably get onto it, but you've got to be that type of football person. You kind of touched on it there. I don't know if that's one of your points, but the difference between the theory and the practical.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't necessarily one that I've got written down for these 5 lessons, but like you said, when I said it and everything, I thought that was a bit of gold dust, really. I think the biggest learning curve for me was when I'd first started at Forest. So I'd started at Forest my final year of my undergrad degree, and like anyone and everything, sort of like a bit of a nerd.
Not you, surely not you.
was really into the theory and practice and everything of sports science and how we can try and improve athletes. And so my first sort of 6 months up until that sort of Christmas time at Forest was just almost like experimenting really with real life subjects of going, well, I've read in the paper that if we do this, we might be able to see this outcome. the reality is 9 times out of 10 in an applied setting, it's not going to happen. And you feel that on reflection, you feel like you've actually wasted a bit of time trying to persevere with it. But I think that then is the biggest learning curve for students, and understanding that a lot of a lot of theory within sports science, particularly laboratory-based theory, isn't really translatable to on the pitch stuff, isn't really applicable. Whereas a lot of the research that we're like starting to see now and everything, which I think is a really positive move, is that the theory is a lot more applied from practitioners that are now actually starting to write more papers. So there is a bit more applied knowledge being sent out there in a research capacity, which I think is great. But yeah, I think a lot, especially early on in your career, I think a lot of that is just trial and error, trying to get things right and wrong, and understanding that not everything translates perfectly. Like the very basics and the underpinnings of basic physiology and biomechanics, they don't change. They're always what you're trying to sort of target and hit. But the way in which we then apply that can change quite drastically. I think it has to as well.
Like you say, it's not one lesson I've got on one of my points, but it's a general theme of a lot of them, because it is a massive part of it. The one story I've got is I remember starting at Newcastle Women like 5 years ago, and I was just coming off the back studying it, and I had all these ideas, and I talked to the manager about it, and we'd do this, we could do this, and it was like, okay, we'll do this. And one of the things we did was, which I was massive on at the time, was written reflection. So it was, what I do right, what I do wrong, what do I need to improve on for the next game, and what do I need to do to win the next game. And I was broken up into mentality and physically, so it was a real reflection of your performance. And we had the players do that like in a kind of meditation sort of way for like 5 minutes in silence, going through that. And that's one of those where it's theoretically, if you said you were doing that on a paper like at university, they'd be like, that's a great idea. Like that's hitting lots of things theoretically, but the practical application of it is like that ain't going down well. Like nobody wants to do that, but you don't learn that until you do it. And that would be advice itself, is to throw yourself into it and take all the opportunities you can, because you don't learn until you actually do that. And I still like do that to this day. Still do stuff and try stuff and think that didn't really work, but you learn a lot from that going forward and doing other things as well. I like to think I don't mess up as much as I did that first time, but you still do to a certain extent. You do all the time. Failing's a natural part of any job, I think, and kind of acceptance of that is okay. But that was my second point, and it's specifically for sports psychologists, really, is to have a clear philosophy, a clear sales pitch. But it might apply to S&C somewhat to sports science, because I've had it where, in the story I gave, is one maybe people listening might have heard before when I've talked to my dad, but I talked to Bill Bezic, and we've had him on the podcast as well. And he said about how he talked to Sir Alex Ferguson the first time. And Sir Alex Ferguson asked him, it was kind of his interview to work at Man United. And Sir Alex asked him, like, how are you going to keep my team at number one? And Bill's response was something like, think, behave, and act like you're number two. And that's such a cool sales pitch. And like that's how it works. Like to be able to take all your theory and simplify it in small nuggets of ways that you can sell it to players and to staff is a massive part, I think, of the job. It is a massive part of the job of sports psychology, because if you just come in with lots of detail and lots of theory, people easily switch off to that. But if you simplify things as much as you possibly can, you probably sat in some of my talks where it's literally, there'll be 5 minutes and there'll be 3 bullet points, or it might be 1 point, and it might be a story with the point, and that's all it is, because actually it's a long day and nobody wants to sit for 40 minutes through a workshop, and you can just get your point across quite simply and engaging. And if that's the way to do it, that's the way to do it. That's a big lesson I've learned massive along the way. Is I was talking to my boss at work, and he said when he started, and I certainly did as well, you start with a belief that everybody wants to listen to you, but the reality is that probably nobody does. Like nobody really cares. They want to crack on with the job that they're doing. So you have to work hard to kind of sell what you're doing all the time. Now, that's from a perspective of sports psychology. I don't know what that's like in sports science, but I imagine there's a bit of that to it.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, there was two things I sort of picked up there. I think in terms of that, your messaging and your philosophy, I think that's got to be consistent, and I also think it's got to be concise. People like time, like it's something we spoke about this year. Like, we're in a professional environment, but we actually probably have a bit less time to do things than what we had before because there is always so much to do. So I think any messaging that you give to players and staff has to be really concise and to the point. But I'd say the slight difference there between sports psychology and sports science is like relatively in football. I think sports science has been around slightly longer in terms of its application, but I think sports psychology is something that, like relatively speaking, is in its infancy, and people are still like trying to accept it. And I think there are certain sort of stereotypes and sort of blockages to utilizing sports psychology to the best of its ability within an applied setting. So it's something that I think sports science are dealing with now, in the sense of we've gone from having to be salesmen to try and sell sports science to players and to coaches to get them to buy into it. Whereas I think now that we're in a point where sports science isn't leaving anytime soon. It's there. It's now part of the very foundations of modern football. So in that sense, you've got to now make sports science applicable and to lots of different people, because, well, we've gone from trying to sell it and make it sort of seem sexy to people, whereas now we need to make it sports science really approachable. Like, people have got to actually understand what we're trying to tell them. We can't produce this really brilliant report that looks mint, but no one actually understands it. It's not very functional. I think the very crux of what we need to do now from our side of the profession is to go, well, how do we make sports science really, really easy for people? And how do we make it as applicable as it can be to lots of different people? Because I think if that's just being led by the sports science department, you're only going to get so much from it. But I think if that's then led by everyone because they understand it, then you get so much better results from it. I think a lot of that as well is buy-in from players. Like, if you make things really, really complex to make yourself seem really intelligent because you've done a degree, you've done a master's, you've done certain accreditations, and you go, oh, I know all of this, this is great, here's a load of information. And people go, that's great, but we don't understand it. You're not having any impact.
When you say sports psychology is infancy, that is absolutely spot on. I've been talking when I was talking to people at the universities, you can really see where we are as sports psychology compared to where sports science has been. If you look 20 years ago, where was sports science then? Don't know, but how did sports science get its foot in the door is a question, and probably we'll get to that point as we get along my points as well. But they've grown into that, and sports psychology is doing that as well. And figuring out how that works that's something I've really enjoyed doing over the past few years. That involves a lot of falling flat on my face, but I've also really enjoyed that because it's trying to do something that isn't there. Like, how does sports psychology work in these environments all the time? It's a question no one's really properly answered. Some people have, but it's not in the mainstream at all. So it really is in infancy. Why I give that point is like you say yourself, simplicity is massive, I think. Why overcomplicate it? Why throw references on there if players aren't going to be interested in it? Really just tell them what they need to know. That's what I've learned a lot of anyway. I don't know if you've got another point, because that was there's two of mine so far.
I mean, before I go on to my second point and everything, just on that last little bit there that you said, I think that in terms of, say, if your example there, like putting references up on a screen because people in football aren't necessarily interested, like the players aren't necessarily interested, and the coaching staff at the time when you're delivering a message probably aren't that interested. And I think that's a massive difference between being in academia and sort of getting into a groove of doing presentations for assignments and everything, and having to make sure everything is spick and spam and like everything from an academic standpoint is top, like tip top, compared to them working in a professional environment. The standards have still got to stay the same in terms of the validity and the reliability of the information that you're giving out, but the way in which those messages are brought across are completely different. So speaking at a conference in an academic setting is completely different to, say, addressing a group of players or addressing a group of staff trying to get a point across. And there's two different skills in there. If that was sort of giving advice to young practitioners now, that'd be one thing that I'd really try and hit home about. Like, the way in which you approach different scenarios has to be very, very different. because you've got to find a way of getting that message across in the best way possible.
Go on, next point, because we've touched on
Yeah,
bottom line more so.
Yeah, so the second point for me was that the person matters more than either the player or the coach. And for me, this has been a long-standing belief that I've had for a long, long time anyway. But I think to actually now verbalize, it's quite an important thing as well. So like I mentioned this with the first point as well, like when you are working in a performance-driven environment, it's really easy to only think about the outcome. But ultimately, you've got to understand the process behind it. I know that's something that we've spoken about a lot as well. And the people are a massive part of that process, particularly within sports science as well, like because there is such a volume of data that we collect on a day-to-day basis. It'd be really, really easy for a lot of people to just see people as a data point or see players as a data point. And it's something that I think sports science has started veering towards slightly, which I think needs to change drastically, because the one thing we can't forget is that before anyone is a footballer or a coach, they are a person, and you can't lose track of that. Because I think if that becomes the case, then people just identify themselves as a footballer or as a coach, rather than actually what their core values are as a person and what they actually want to do with their life. I think that's a really important thing. I think with that as well, I think should you actually get to know the person, I think it adds an awful lot of context to data that we collect on a daily basis. I think that's why sports science is now starting to sort of move in the right direction a little bit. If we do start having these conversations with players, now we have on a daily basis, so we get the players to complete a daily wellness questionnaire each morning. And for me, yes, that data is great. It gives us a nice little snapshot of what's happened with that player that day. But for me, anything that sort of flags on that day is a cue to have a conversation with that player, because that's the only way you're going to add context to what data they're giving you. Likewise, then, in terms of, say, the physical outputs that we get from a session, if, say, a player has run slightly less, is there a reason behind that? Is the player just not feeling good about themselves? Is there something going on at home? Is there something going on with family? I think those conversations and understanding that the person really, really matters is paramount to anything that we do nowadays.
This is going to be a theme of the episode, obviously, but I think there's a lot we can learn from each other's work, each other's jobs, each other's fields. It is vice versa. You talk about understanding the human element in sports science. Obviously, in sports psychology, that is all that's about, is understanding the person. But I also think it's a point I'll get onto probably in more depth later. But something we can work on certainly as sports psychologists is the objective, is the structure that sports science kind of provides, how it's overtaken the day, how it is a massive part of the day-to-day of football. How does sports psychology its little role in that as well? But I think it learns a lot from sports science to do that. I've got a similar point, which is similar to yours, in terms of knowing, getting to know the person. But number 3 for me was building relationships. Like, you can't do anything without building relationships first, without having that foundation first. From a sports psychology point of view, if you're trying to you have to understand the client before you can actually help them, is one thing entirely. Like, you have to have that foundation, but you also have to understand a player and get to know a player so that they want to be helped by you. Like, that's a big step in itself. Going back to a point I mentioned before, not people aren't interested in what you're saying necessarily. But if you get to know the person, if you can help them, guide them in what they want to do, not fight them too much in what they're doing, that's something I'm learning still. Is how to do sports psychology in a way that how can you help and support players, coaches, staff, whatever, but also challenge them at the same time, because that's challenge them in terms of the sports psychology side of things and what you have to say, because I think there has to be a balance in that. Reaching that balance all the time is a difficult thing, but a starting point for that, I think, is building the relationships, is getting to know people, because that's the only way you can do it. I imagine that's the same with sports science as well, because you're trying to get people to go to the gym, you're trying to get them to hit targets objectively that you want them to improve. And I imagine a lot of that, you have to understand the person in front of you to get them to do the session, to get them to do this, to get them to do that. You can't force people to do these things. You got to know them first. Why do they want to do it? All right, you want to do it because we've had that conversation before, and you want to do this and that, and well, look, we'll link this to that. You got to do this to get that. I'm telling you about your job here, but you tell me.
I think that's a really important thing, and I really like the point you made there. I think the best sort of like working example of that, I'll try and relate everything as much to the day to day as possible, is say like we've spoken a lot this year as a staffing group about like sort of co-coaching and helping out where we can when someone else is leading a session. And so on the days where I'm not leading the warm up and everything, when I'm not off, I'm then off working with sort of the guys that are doing their reconditioning stuff on the pitch. Your role then is to try and sort of drive intensity in the warm up and the sessions that you're a part of and you can have a hand in. And I think part of that is then, like you said, understanding the individual and understanding the person. And there's certain players that say on an extensive day where we work in sort of bigger spaces and there's lots of high speed running and a big element of that to it, and you've really got to drive players to get them to push and try and hit max speeds. There's certain players where you can really, really push and sort of grind them a little bit to get them to work a bit more. But there's certain players you must sort of have to take a bit more of a step back and go, they don't need this extra, because otherwise it's going to tip them over the edge. They're either going to rebel against it and not work as hard, or they'll work too hard and fall off the edge. So like you said, I think it is finding that balance for players. And I think it's understanding what works for different people. Like there's a great old saying, like the different horses for different courses. And I think it's the exact same. And when we start coaching the players as well, there's different ways we have to work with different players to try and get the best out of them.
It's a simple point, is getting to know a player. I feel like it's always a point that's made, but I also think it's one that's never really properly applied massively as well. Like we all know it should be done, but it's also, how do you do it? A great example you give there is like, is that in the one, how much intensity you want to give to one person to another? I wonder what you think, but when I started, and I think when you do, and it's probably a great point for any students listening, is that you kind of go, here's my theory, here's my ideas, I'm going to implement my ideas and they're going to work, and it's going to work uniformly. It's going to work for everyone, and it ain't going to work for everyone. It's a key aspect of, we talk about in psychology, but it's like a needs assessment, but essentially it's just getting to know people. Is like, where are they at? What are they thinking? What do they think about what you're talking about? Be honest with me. Like, do you agree with what I'm saying? I give you an opinion. Do you agree with that or not? I don't mind either way, but I need to know what you think. Because when I first started, when I give that example, when I first started, right, we're going to do this because this will work. I never took that time to get to know the players or get to know people. When I first started, I was really bad at that. Like I was going into the world of women's football as well. It's a world I didn't really know, so I just kind of didn't know how to talk to anyone in it. And I got much better at that. It's sort of, and keep going, you know, and yeah, but that's a massive part of it, because you're doing something that's really tangible. So I think there's real clear feedback for you whether you're doing what you're doing and whether it's working or not. And what I do, it's not that tangible at all. It's not that objective at all. It's so subjective and it's so unseen. But the problem is you don't know what's going on. You need to know what's going on with these people. You need to talk to them. You need to get to know them, because you don't know. You can see a performance, but you need to understand the context of why that performance happening is, whether it's a good one or a bad one, whether they made a mistake or whether they've been fantastic. Why? And you don't know that answer. They'll know that answer because they've lived that day. What happened before? What happened in the week? What did you hear? What did you see? Right, great. Oh, that's brilliant. That worked for you. Well, let's try and incorporate that a bit more. It's that sort of understanding, which it's a collaboration and it's a drop of the ego, really, which I think you learn quite quickly when you go into practically applying stuff. There's so many cooks, so you got to drop that ego pretty quick, or else it becomes really difficult.
Yeah, the big learning point for me when I first sort of started working in women's football was when I first started coaching. I acted like the coach that I felt I needed when I was playing.
Yeah.
And that coach was definitely not the coach that the players needed. Mm-hmm. That I was then working with. And so that for me was then a stark reality check of going, oh, right, you actually need to change it up and target what you're doing now to the players you're actually working with. I don't know, that sounds such a simple point and almost sort of something that probably doesn't really warrant talking about. But I think particularly for young practitioners getting into sport, don't be sort of so hell-bent on, this is how I wanted to be coached, this is how I'm going to do it. I think you've got to understand that the way that you work is completely different to the way that anyone else is going to want you to work with them. And so don't worry, your core beliefs and your core values have got to stay the same, but the way in which those messages are then portrayed to the players and the staff and the coaching, that's got to be sort of wrapped around the way they want to work and the way it's going to get the best out of them. And it was a mistake that I made countless times that first sort of 6 months at Forest. But it was one of them. I had a great mentor in Marcus Ward, who I'm still really good friends with now, that we had those conversations sort of quite a lot to talk about how that sort of how we shift things. And it was one of them sort of after Christmas, everything just sort of clicked into place and everything started working because I took a bit more of a personal approach with the players. Was a little bit more interested in what was going on outside of football to try and then sort of combat the issues we were having on the pitch. And that for me was like one of the best moves that, like career-wise, I think I will ever make.
I think you go into these things wanting, like you say, you go in being an archetype of what you think the role should be, what the type of person should be. Right, I'm doing this, and we're super serious, and you got to be this character. And it's a lesson I think you've got to learn by doing it, is that actually the best way to work and build those relationships is to be yourself, which is actually a really easy thing to do when you let yourself fall into that and do that. Because that's the best way to build connections, to be humble in your faults as well and your everything. Because I think you start with insecurity naturally. You're like, I've done this before. I'm going to get found out. I need to play this. I need to do this. I need to be this person. And that only, I think that really just sets you up for failure straight away. Yeah, you've got to be open, humble and honest in everything that you do. To balance that also with, we have it in sports psychology, to balance that also with, I have something to bring here with sports psychology and I do know what I'm talking about. So to balance those two things is a real difficult thing in itself, and that'll probably be an episode entirely on its own. But that, yeah, to be humble is the best way probably to build those relationships. I feel like that's 3 points from mine. How many points have you given so far?
I've given 2 so far. But I can crack on my third one. My third one was to be a sponge.
Okay.
Now, to put context into this and everything, so I recently rewatched Gordon Ramsay's High Performance podcast again the other week, and it was one of those points that sort of stuck in my mind from sort of his 3 non-negotiables. Now, I was slightly going a little bit of a tangent with this as well. In terms of that sponge and everything, a sponge always has 2 sides. It's got that hard and abrasive side, and it's also got that soft side. Now, I think sometimes, particularly working in sport, there's got to be a side where you are a little bit rougher and tougher, and you've got to sort of really work hard and grind a little bit. But on the flip side of that, you've got the softer side where you actually need to be really, really absorbent to a lot of things, particularly early on in your career. I think like a career in football, hopefully, touch wood, will be a long career. But there's so much to learn in such a short space of time as well. So I think particularly working in full-time football, there are so many learning opportunities day to day. Like the thing that I've got written down here is like whether it's necessarily applicable to your role or not, you should still be trying to learn from as many situations as possible. Like there's bits that I've learned this year from how other coaches have interacted with players, how you've interacted with players, how players interact with other players as well in terms of how their relationships work. And you just try and soak up as much of that information as possible, because that's only going to make you richer further down the line. And I think it's one of those as well where I've spoken a lot there about the actual application of that and trying to move forward and being absorbent and everything. But I think a big part of it as well is absorb all the good memories as well. Like we've been fortunate enough in our career so far where we have had some success, and hopefully that continues as well. But 95% of people in football don't have silverware success. They have relative success, and that's fantastic, and I think that's really, really important to keep track of as well. But silverware isn't always the be all and end all, and I think sometimes like the good times you have with colleagues that you work with or mates that you work with are really important as well. And you don't want to forget those moments looking back at your career. So absorb everything that you can, like the good moments, the bad moments, the relationships, the learnings, everything. You should be trying to suck as much up of it as possible.
That really ties in well with what I was just saying before as well, because it's that both being humble and being open, equally also being applicable and doing what you think you need to do with your job. But the being a sponge, massive aspect, because you have to all the time be open to, and that comes with a lack of ego as well that you've got to have. is like, what can you learn from any situation? Like, so a big part of what we're doing here is the lessons we're learning, because we're always learning stuff all the time and talking to yourself, because you can learn from sports science as well, not just sports psychologists themselves, and not just from myself and my experience. It's you as well. It's just being massively open to everything all the time, and that's probably goes back to if you're a student listening, or if you're trying to get into that work, is just try and experience as much as you possibly can, because I think you find yourself getting better through failure and doing lots of different things and seeing what other people do and going, oh, I'll try a bit of that as well, or seeing what doesn't work and going, I'm definitely not going to do that. All those things, and being, yeah, I think it's an insecurity when you start, is you got to, when you say when you're young, we're still young, but you go, oh, I get it. I'm a bit of a nightmare for that. Like I always think I'm right, so I always go, I know it. So you go, I know this, yeah, I try and stop myself so much from doing that, because you've got to be open to being wrong, because then you're open to improving. I was watching someone the other day. It was someone to do with, I can't go into the details of it, but it was about someone who invests in businesses, what they look for in entrepreneurs. And the key point they said was humbleness. Is that a word? They were humble. That was the key thing they were looking for, which was because everything, there's always something wrong with a person or whatever, with anything. But to have the awareness of that is massively key to improving. If you go in thinking I'm perfect, well, you just be wrong, and you'll never fix that problem either, and you'll never improve as well. Now, to be like that and to also be confident in what you're doing at the same time is a difficult balance to have, I think. But that's it. That is a key part of it, and that's probably how you grow and develop and keep going.
So I think with being a sponge as well, I think a lot of that comes with sort of sometimes things that you see on a day-to-day basis will either reaffirm your preconceived conceptions about certain things and go really affirm it and go, right, that's really what I believe in. Or sometimes it might challenge those preconceived conceptions as well, because you might then go, well, that's not what I thought it would end up being like. And so then likewise, like you're saying, it is learning. You're just trying to learn from experiences, and that's the best way to learn.
Yeah,
I think, like, bring it back to academics and everything like you were talking about. Yeah, we can learn so much from reading a textbook, attending lectures, seminars, labs, reading journals, but the best way to learn is actually doing. Go out and do it.
I'll go on to my fourth point, which is similar to building relationships, but slightly different, is working with staff and coaching the coaches is a key part of what we do in sports psychology. How you actually make an impact is a key part into how you make an impact in the environment. If you work in isolation, there's not a massive amount of impact you're going to be making. A lot of things happen through the process of the day to day. And with sports psychology, I'm a firm believer that sports psychology isn't just the one-on-one consultation. I think the one-on-one consultation with players and everything like that is a minimal part of it. I think a large part of it is, how is it integrated into the day to day? How does it work with the staff and the coaches? Because ultimately they are the ones impacting the players and talking to the players on a much more regular basis. When I was giving a talk the other day, it's funny, sports psychology, that job, because it's a job where you've got to get to know the players and talk to them, but it's actually a job where you have the least amount of contact time with them compared to everyone else. So you'll have it, because in sports science, you're doing the gym session with them, you're doing the warm up with them, you get those opportunities for conversation all the time. There'll be a sports psychology workshop every now and again. But other than that, it's very informal. It's very being around and about and making that work. And that's building those relationships, but working with the staff as well. Because you're not going to get that contact time with them. So how are you going to work with the staff and get that relationship built with the coaches and everyone else? So that, say, if I'm working with you, I can talk to you about sports psychology, and then that stuff informs the work that you're doing. Now, if I can inform the work you're doing, that's a big impact I can have. If I inform the work that coach is doing on the session, it's very unseen, nobody's going to see me doing that. But that is actually how you make the most impact. You never looks at overtly like you're doing anything, but actually the small conversation behind the scene actually has the biggest impact on it. And the key part is building the relationships and integrating the role into the day-to-day. That's a big challenge for our role as sports psychologists. How does it, both in a practical sense, how does it fit in the day-to-day, but also how do you actually get along with these coaches and help them and support them instead of stepping on toes? I feel like the sports psychology role is one of those that's so similar to, it's so stepping on the toes of what coaches already do in terms of motivation and working with players. And so you've got to really work well and integrate with them. And I find that a team, and this is for any, I know it from my dad and from anywhere, the team revolves around its man. I was literally just watching the 99 documentary, the Man United treble documentary, and there was literally a point there they were saying that it all revolves around Sir Alex. Like, he is the man. And that's it. Like, say if you worked in that 99 environment, if you didn't have a good relationship with Sir Alex and informed a lot of what you were talking about, you aren't doing anything. Right? You won't be doing anything. You know, you can have the conversation and work individually with players, and that's an impact in itself. But to have a larger impact and to affect the whole team, it has to be through the coaches, it has to be through the manager, it has to be through the staff. That's the biggest impact you can have. I don't know how that applies to sports science, but that's kind of a big lesson from my one.
Yeah, I think the first point that sort of comes to mind when you were sort of talking about that, mate, was how we've worked with each other this year from a sports science and psychology point of view. And the two examples I've got there are similar to the daily wellness stuff, when we both sit down in the morning, sit next to each other on the same desk and go through player by player if there's anything sort of flagging, and whether that's a conversation for us to have as a sports science department with the player, or for you to have from a psychology point of view with the player as well. I think that's something I think we've done. I think we started to find a nice sort of sweet spot really for that towards the back end of the season. I think the other one, like you were talking about having like a day-to-day impact, I think that's probably one of the more understated parts of it. Like, actually having those conversations with the coach and everything to go, right, how is that then going to impact that player within this session? And then the second one, which is possibly as big, if not bigger, is when you are working with the long-term injury players and you're doing that reconditioning work with them. And I think everyone can appreciate that when you are out injured for a long time and away from the rest of the squad, that can be a really lonely and challenging place. I think it can be it's a very tough place as well, because obviously from a sports science perspective, when they do get back on the pitch and everything, we're trying to push them at the right pace, at the right tempo, to get back to match fitness, to get back into full squad training, to start then pushing for match minutes as well. So it can be a really, really tough environment for players going through, which is then again where sort of from working on the pitch with them and everything, to you then sort of having those conversations with them and sort of being around on the pitch and picking up on things is really, really important. And those conversations that we have on a day-to-day basis, talking about players and how they're feeling, how they're dealing with certain things, is paramount to then the long-term success of that player making it back into contention for match minutes.
But they're such small things, aren't they? And it almost look insignificant. Like it's not seen, but I think it does have a big impact. Like the work that you'll do. I look at it from sports science. Probably leads back to something we were talking about before. It's the, I imagine the theory and do this workout to get this impact and improve this and that. But I imagine the difference between an effective sports scientist and an ineffective one is probably the relationships that they build, because it's getting them to engage with what you want them to be doing. That long-term injury player example is it entirely. If you're trying to get a player to come back from injury, you have to find a way to keep them motivated in what they're doing. I find with injured players, it's so difficult because football is their entire world and it gets taken away from them. And it's how do you get that player to be motivated enough? There's no competition, there's no game, there's no football. How do you get them to have that same motivation to go at the gym they do actually playing the game? Now I think a sports scientist that clocks onto that and figures that out has a bigger impact on especially long-term injury than anyone else does. Like every job, I think it's all people at the end of the day, and that's probably a big theme of this conversation is yes, it's theory, but there's people there, and the marrying of the two is a real complicated thing, which I think both of us sitting here are going, we don't really know the answer fully, but we're kind of getting there, trying to figure it out. But I think a lot of people are probably in our position figuring it out because that's the reality of working in it. How do you marry all these things properly to make them the most effective they possibly can? The theory and the practical, theory and the person behind it. Getting those things to work. That's the thing that's fascinated me the most over the past few seasons. Like that is, and you realise how that is the difference. Like I said, between those that are effective and those that aren't.
Yeah, I think for me that it's a great point you make there in terms of how well can every facet of sports science or performance sport work together in sort of trying to find out how it best works. And I think for me that is a bit of a black hole.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anyone, no matter where you are in the world, whatever sport you are, whatever level it's at, has actually cracked that code yet.
Mm.
Because there's always going to be, that's, I think it's just the nature of working in performance sport. There's always going to be something you can do a little bit better.
Yeah.
You're never going to have the answer. And to put it in blunt terms, the answer doesn't ever exist.
Yeah. Exactly.
You're always working towards perfection, but perfection's a fallacy. There isn't such a thing.
No.
You're just trying to make things a bit better each time you try and refine that process. And I think that's the really important part.
Yeah, but perfection doesn't exist, like you say. It's the player in front of you. It is.
Yeah.
It is different every time. And there might be some themes between them, but it's everything's a new. Like we talk about learning there, because you have to be open. Because if you're rigid, you are not working well with the different personalities that you're working with. You have to be open, and you have to learn that, or else you're not doing anything. I've got 4 points there. I don't know, what are you on? I can't remember.
So if I say this, so this will be 4 points now once I say this one.
Okay, that'll be fine. Go for that.
My fourth learning point was you're not going to get it right all the time.
Yeah.
I think this is such an important one as well. Like you've got to appreciate that you're going to make mistakes, and that doesn't discriminate at any point in your career.
Yeah,
you could be a pro 30 years into your career, and you're still going to make mistakes. Yeah. Those mistakes are very different to the mistakes you make early on in your career, but you're not going to get it right. 100% of your work is not going to be spot on all the time. But there's got to be an appreciation from you as an individual about that as well, to understand that you're not going to be perfect. But I think there's also got to be an appreciation from players and staff as well around you to go, everything we do isn't always going to be 100% correct. Because there's always going to be one thing that you can pick holes in anything. That's very, very easy to do. But an appreciation of the fact that you're moving in the right direction, no one makes a mistake on purpose, is really important. And the one thing that I've got down here, and I can speak from personal experience about this, it might take you 3, 4, or even 5 times to really nail something down and get the hang of it. But the satisfaction from actually doing that is unmatched, because then you think it's almost like you've cracked the code for that one little bit.
Yeah.
But then when you take a step back and you look really objectively at it, you go, that is literally just one brick in a very, very big wall that you've managed to nail in properly.
Yeah.
But the satisfaction of that's really, really good. And I'd also say, like, the other point I've got written on this as well is, whilst any sort of like negative feedback in the moment might really, really sting and hurt, because it does, like everyone thinks that they're doing well, and then when you get a bit of feedback that's a bit more negative, you're like, oh, that hurts a little bit, because you think you should be proud of the work that you produce. I'm a big believer in that. You should give it time, attention to detail, that when you do produce something, you are proud of it. But any feedback you do get that even is negative, you've got to take it professionally and not personally.
Yeah.
And then from that, everything, like we've spoken about this before, any feedback is a great learning opportunity. I think you've got to be sort of confident enough and vulnerable enough in that sense as well to be willing to accept that. And I think the last point with this bit as well is, you're never as good as what everyone says you are when it's going well, and you're not as bad as what everyone says you are when something's gone wrong.
Yeah.
Somewhere in between all of that is a nice happy middle ground, which is where I think everyone tends to be.
Yeah.
So I think having that level-headedness to go, if you've won 5 or 6 on the spin and all the players are improving physically, yeah, that's great. And everyone's like, this is the best thing since sliced bread. And then on the flip side of that, if you lose 3 or 4 on the bounce and players start regressing slightly, it might not necessarily be the worst thing in the world, because it offers you that opportunity to then reassess and think, okay, well, where are things going wrong? Where are the gaps in the wall here that we need to start plugging?
I've got loads of points for that, because like you're saying there, I'd be a bit of a hypocrite if I didn't agree with you, because that's something I talk about a lot with players. You have to embrace, sort of with clients from any sport really, you have to embrace mistakes and you have to embrace setback, and be able to be present and react to it in the moment. And you've got to be able to do that probably in any profession as well as actually playing also. On the side of that as well, I've been reading a lot. So I've been reading a lot, which I never thought I'd get into, but Stephen Bartlett and the CEO and Dad's really been interested in him, and we've talked a lot about that, and I've been reading his book. But one of the things he was talking about was a rate of failure. And he said every successful business has a high rate of failure. It's probably similar to something we talked about before, but it's like the continuous experimentation, the ability to learn quickly, to try stuff, to learn quickly is a massive skill to have. To be hesitant and rigid and stuck still means you got no chance. But if you are present and if you are experimenting, if you're making mistakes, all those things, you're learning all the time and you're building. And I've been listening to, it's got nothing to do with sport. I listened to Elon Musk as well, and a book about him. And that is key to him as well, is the rate of failure, is the making the mistakes, is going again, is going again, is going again. Is a massive part to a success in any field, really. But it's very similar to ours and what we do. You just what we talked about at the start of this podcast as well is just trying stuff and learning. Once you've tried it and learnt it, you have knowledge there that not many people will have.
As well, I think making mistakes, and if you are going to make a mistake, own it.
Yeah.
Like really own that, because the last thing anyone wants, particularly in professional sport, is for someone to go, "Oh, that wasn't me. It was not me."
Yeah,
that's the worst thing you can do. Whereas if you turn around and go, "Look, hold my hands up. Didn't mean it. I apologize. Won't happen again." There's a lot more respect that's bestowed with that.
That's a real difficult place to get to, because you naturally go into working from learning about something to working in it with a lot of insecurity. So your first reaction ain't gonna be, yeah, that was me. I made another mistake. Brilliant. But I don't know where that comes from, the ability to start embracing that. But I think it comes from embracing that philosophy really of experimentation, of knowing that the failures themselves, they help you get better, and look at it in terms of your rate of failure and make sure it's as high as possible within reason. Make sure it's as high as possible so you can keep learning as much as possible as well. But it has to come from acceptance of that. Was that your last point?
No. So I've got one more after this.
Go on. Give me your last one, and then I'll give my last one.
Right. So my last one, it can be quite philosophical, this one. So we might have a bit of a chat about this.
Here we go.
It was exercise the inner kid.
Okay. Explain that one.
I'm probably going to butcher this slightly, so I do apologize if anyone is still listening to us ramble on after all of this time.
They've all switched off now, so you can say what you want.
So Professor Steve Peterson, everything, obviously wrote his well-renowned book and everything about the chimp paradox.
Yeah.
Now, this is sort of loosely related to that. His work bases around the fact that everyone has this chimp and everything in the brain where they've got to either lock the chimp away to not let it detriment their own performance, or unlock it to allow them to improve their own performance. And the way everyone's relationship with their chimp is slightly different. My model on this is very different to that, and it's not quite as academic or quite as smart. My thought process is everyone has this inner child, whether it's in their soul, in their heart, in their head, wherever it is. And I think it's really important to exercise that kid as much as possible, and like almost sort of take people back to being a child when they don't have any worries, they don't have any stresses, particularly in performance sport. Like we've spoken before about the intensity in football being unmatched by most other things. I think it's the same for that pressure as well. Now, it's not the same pressure as, say, the everyday person would have, because I think the pressures that professional footballers are afforded are very, very different. and I think you're battling with a very different kettle of fish. But because football can be so intense, and because it can be somewhat rigid sometimes as well, because it is so performance based and it is so results driven, we've got to allow both players and staff the opportunity to exercise the little kid, to allow them to have that little bit of fun, which for me as a sports scientist is a really nice little creative challenge as well. Because how do you get the physical outcomes that you want from out of a session or out of a warm up, but still allow people to engage that child element of it, engage them in the sense of they're not having to worry about, say, doing an accel or a decel on an intensive day. They're just thinking about, I need to get to that ball before they pass it. In which case, if they do that, you're still going to hit the accel and the decel for a pressing action. And I think it's trying to find that enjoyment factor. And it's something that we spoke at the very first point that we spoke about, allowing people to enjoy it, finding ways of creating enjoyment out of what can be stressful situations. I think that's a massive, massive thing that people need to start thinking about and really sort of focusing on as well.
When you speak of that, it goes back to what the point I made about failure rate and the improvement that comes with that. If you look at how you have progressed as a human, the most progression you've done is when you're a child. That's when you're most malleable, but that's when you play the most, because you experiment the most, and there's a freedom to that and there's an acceptance to that. And to try and keep all of that as much as possible is key. When you talk about keeping that with that instinctive thought of like, right, I need to go to the ball, that is an instinctive thought that comes through play. That comes from being in the zone, that comes from being in that flow state, and that comes from a combination of those external factors aligning really well with the internal factors, where the challenge is matched with the skill, and then you're in the zone, and then you're playing. And when you're playing, you're accepting of mistakes, and you're in the zone, you're in the you're fluid to everything that's going on, and that's when you perform at your best. And that's kind of that is probably a key thing. It's a real difficult thing to sell, but if you're going, it's the same of an athlete going into a performance. I think it's the same of the audience we're talking to today, which is people trying to get into their professions or what they're doing or doing it for the first time. Can you go into it relaxed and looking to enjoy it? Because then you'll be at your best. If you go in rigid and overthinking, like a player does, they make mistakes. You know, in your profession, you'll make mistakes. We make mistakes, but you won't be at your best if you're overthinking it. Now, if you're in the zone, if you're in the flow, if you're being instinctive, when you talk about in a child, what I always think of is the passion. Again, it's like that first point we made, is the passion that we have for it. The passion I have for sports psychology. I try and not let anything get in the way of that. Like I do stuff that I feel like excited about, which kind of leads on my last point. But I do stuff that because if it's exciting me, I think it's something that's right, because instinctively, from what I've learned about, like, right, this is a good idea, and that's where instinct comes from. It's the instinct of all that backed up knowledge that you have, and that's how you perform at your best as well. But the last point I've got is what I'm learning at the moment, which is making the job more structured and objective. So the challenges I've faced in my role is something we talked about in the episode here, is making it structured, making it work day to day, making it work really. It's beyond just the one-on-one consultation part. And I've got the way I'm perceiving it now is a real excitement of like, oh, what a great challenge, and then I'm really just diving into it. And I was showing you just before we recorded this the little bits I've got going on, but that makes me really excited. But that wouldn't have come from learning from that season and then going, oh, here's a better way of doing it. And I'd like to do that every season. And I wonder, we're just going on tangents, but I don't think I would like to do everything the same every time. I think I'd like to improve everything every time, all the time, and not from a position of, oh my God, I need to get better because I'm flipping terrible. But it's from a like excitement of like, oh, this could be better. I could do this better. Or like, okay, this was how I did this time. Oh, but what if I did this way? And I've learned a lot from sports science in terms of making it objective. Every day sitting with you lot doing GPS and seeing you doing the testing and seeing how objective it all is. To get the buy-in for sports psychology, I think a massive part of that is making it objective as well. When I say that, I imagine there's a lot of sports psychologists going, but it's not objective, it's all subjective, and it is. But to have that objective data to then go and have a subjective perspective on it, like you lot do, and you probably get better in sports science making that balance. I think we can as well in sports psychology. And then having that structure, having that subjective viewpoint as well on the data that you're finding from observations and stuff, and then marrying that all together and making it work day to day. I'm tying it in a bit to what you were talking about there, but that was kind of my last point, is the structure. How can you make it structured? How can you make it work? Sports psychology is in infancy, like you were saying. It's so at the start. And it's a great point. I was talking to someone at Man United ages ago, a few months ago, and he's the head of wellbeing now, which is a really interesting job. I'll probably do another episode on. But he was saying, we were talking about sports psychology. At the time, I was a bit pessimistic. I don't know where it's going, sports psychology, because it seems to be fighting the same battle for years and years. It's been in the same place. And what he said to me was really good. He was like, well, a few years ago, physios used to be the man with a bucket and a sponge, and now they're a key part of the process of the day-to-day. And it's like, yeah. So that's the big challenge for sports psychology is right now with the man with the bucket and the sponge, how do we become the physio? And a big part of that is structure and objectivity and real outcomes from day to day, which, yeah, I don't know how the hell you're going to add to that, but that's my perspective on sports psychology. But you crack on.
Yeah, I think obviously, like we touched on this before, I think sports science in a sort of a different sort of time in the minute to sports psychology, particularly within an applied footballing sense. Like our structure is almost sort of very set out. You know, we come in the morning, we'll put all the GPS stuff on charge, ready for the session, go through all the players' daily wellness stuff as they come in each morning, have those conversations, have conversations with the coaches about the actual session that's going to be delivered in terms of pitch sizes, the sort of the thresholds that are on the session in terms of total distances, high speed running stuff, accels and decels. Then it's having all of those individual conversations with players that need to have conversations with. Then you're off then doing pre-activation with the players pre-session, going off and doing that. Then the session itself, so you'd be doing the warm-up, checking the iPad, checking to see where players are in terms of their outputs from an external point of view. After that, you're then back in, collecting all the GPS back in, collecting all of the internal load data as well, which is really important, downloading all of the GPS data, sorting out or sifting through all of the GPS data, cropping it, clipping it, downloading it, doing the GPS report, sending out the GPS report to the players and the staff and everything with a few comments on to sort of describe what's happened within the session and what might need to happen in the future. And then off to the gym and doing like the gym stuff, doing all the programming for the gym. There's so much going on like to a structure in our day that is completely different to you guys in sports psychology. And like you said, I think it is difficult because, like you mentioned before, there is an objectivity to sports science. There's physical data that everyone can see. Whereas with sports psychology, like you said, so many people just see it as a subjective science. Like there is only so much objectivity you can put to it. And so I do think it can be harder for you guys on that side of the coin to find that structure. So it's then, I think it's almost a case of what works for the individual and what works for that environment, I think is the most important things. And like we said, a big feature of this podcast today has probably been like the term impact. Like how can you as a sports psychologist have the greatest impact on both the players and the staff to positively impact the session?
Exactly that. I just want to thank Tom there for coming on and adding to what I think was a really interesting conversation. Hopefully one that's going to be productive for a lot of you lot listening, a lot of you working either in sports psychology or sports science or in any subject, whatever it is, wanting to get into sport or wanting to get into football. Hopefully some of that advice is helpful out of all the things that we discussed. Just to kind of summarize it and take some key points out of it. I think the first point really that we made with regards to loving the topic and loving what you're doing is definitely a key one because there are many obstacles and a lot of time that goes into work that you do. And the passion you have for it, passion you have for the sport also, is something that carries you massively throughout that. And it's something that both me and Tom, and I know a lot of members of staff that I know that work in sport and football would definitely agree with as well. The second one, and I think this is a really key one as well, is being okay with trying and with failing and with pushing on those things. A high level of failure rate will probably sum up that point. To keep trying things over and over, learning from them as much as you can, and getting better from that. Being accepting of making those mistakes is a key part of doing the job, and it is a key part of learning as well. You're not going to get it right every time. I think the third point that I also take from that conversation as well is be open and learn from everything. There's many experiences that you're going to have applying what you want to apply. And talking from my point of view, sports psychology is things that work, things that don't work, and to be observant and to listen, to take feedback, all those things is absolutely key to developing and learning and getting better at what you do, not being rigid, but being open all the time to all those different experiences. It only makes you better at what you do at the end of the day. There's a point that Tom wanted to make towards the end, but we didn't have time to fit it in. It's kind of like a long episode as it was. But one point he made was say less and listen more. And I think that is probably key as well to what we talked about there, being open and learning all the time, is to be observant, is to see what's happening, to take in as much as you can around you from the experiences that you have. That does massive things for your development, more so than trying to make an impact all the time, trying to say things. Just be quiet and listen. And there's such an advantage to doing that all the time. One point as well, that I don't think we really touched on too much in the conversation, but I think is a key one that Tom also added was know your role, know your responsibility, know what your area is and what you're doing, and stick to that. Something we talked about as well. So many different people doing different things, and there's always areas where you can step on people's toes. Be specific with what you're doing, be specific to your area, and that is where you can make the most impact at the end of the day with regards to the team and the performance and how everybody else works as well. But yeah, that is everything. I hope that is all productive and interesting, but let us know if it is or it isn't, and if you want to hear anything else or hear something different, just let me know. But for now, thank you for watching and listening, and I'll see you again at some point.